If there's one series of movies that has had some major ups and downs, it's definitely the Alien franchise. This is a collection of films that has historically seen some dramatic changes in tone with each installment, thanks mainly to the fact that each one is the vision of a different director. So we went from a claustrophobic horror film to a sci-fi action spectacular, followed by a depressing sort of horror prison drama thing, and then whatever the hell was going on in Alien Resurrection. Ah! Likewise, games based on the Alien series have been all over the map, ranging from absolutely awesome to some of the worst games I've ever played. More recently, Alien Isolation really got the formula right and gave us an honest-to-goodness, scary game that really does capture the spirit of the first film, effectively making the Xenomorphs seem like the frightening and deadly horror icon it truly is.
That was scary!
But throughout the 80s and 90s, when technology put a limit on what kinds of games could be made, the Alien series jumped from one genre to another time and time again, with some wildly mixed results. So with that in mind, let's take a look at a big bunch of retro Alien games, and find out which ones are worth playing and which ones deserve to be ejected into space. In 1979, a little movie with an unassuming title hit theaters and scared the hell out of audiences, and also had them running to their doctors to get checked for parasites, and that movie was Alien. It told a pretty simple story. An alien xenomorph gets aboard a spacecraft and kills off the crew one by one, until the final crew member, Ellen Ripley, is left with no choice but to destroy the ship and ultimately launch the alien out of an airlock. It's essentially a slasher movie set in space, but the stunning cinematography, creepy atmosphere, great performances, and outstanding special effects elevated Alien to the annals of horror movie greatness. It was mesmerizing, terrifying, and at times graphically violent, but that still didn't stop them from making it into a toy for kids.
Don't, he'll destroy the spaceship. We've lost. Better find another ship. Let's try the kitchen. Another triumph for Alien.
Alien action figure, new from Kenner.
So with that in mind, what kind of game could you make on the consoles available at the time that accurately replicated the sheer terror and claustrophobia of Alien? Well, that question was answered in 1982 with Alien on the Atari 2600, and the answer was Pac-Man. Yeah, it's just Pac-Man with Xenomorphs. And I mean, that's literally it. I know there were a lot of maze games coming out at the time that emulated the gameplay of Namco's Yellow Icon, but this is perhaps the most blatant I've ever seen. You're not explicitly told that you're playing as Ripley, but I'm just going to assume that you are. And the goal of the game is to make your way through the halls of your spaceship, represented here by a maze, and destroy all of these xenomorph eggs, which are of course dots, all while avoiding the ghosts, adult xenomorphs that are also roaming the halls. You can dispatch them by grabbing the glowing pulsar, thus turning them blue and making them killable. Simply collect all of the eggs, grab some score bonuses whenever they pop up, and complete a bonus stage at the end of each maze, which again has you dodging xenomorphs while attempting to grab a prize. And that's the entire game. Just a shameless and blatant Pac-Man knockoff, even down to having almost identical sound effects. I get it, there's not a lot you can do with the Atari 2600, but regardless of that fact, I think a movie as historic and groundbreaking as Alien deserved better than this. Luckily for this game though, in space, no one can hear you suck. It wouldn't be until 1986 that a sequel to Alien would be unleashed on the world in the form of James Cameron's Aliens, which is arguably the greatest film sequel of all time and took the premise of the original in an all-new direction, being much more of an action film than a horror film, though there are still plenty of scares included too. This time around, instead of a single xenomorph, there was an entire hive of them. And on the opposite end are the Colonial Marines, armed to the teeth with guns, flamethrowers, explosives, and of course, harsh language.
Fuck you, man.
Anytime, anywhere.
Are you finished?
With this being much more of an action-oriented movie, and the fact that lots of video games at the time had you blasting aliens anyway, it was perfect for a video game adaptation. But honestly, it inspired a lot more games than it actually spawned. But in 1989, Aliens was converted into an absolutely awesome arcade game by Konami, which is fitting since they had already taken so much inspiration from it when developing the Contra series. And similar to those games, Aliens is 100% balls to the wall action, where you play as Ripley armed with the iconic smart gun, mowing down legions of xenomorphs on her way to rescue Newt, destroy the colony on LV-426, and eradicate the alien menace. In addition to the smart gun, you'll also be provided with some serious firepower in the form of a spread gun, missile launcher, grenades, and of course the almighty flamethrower. And if you've got a second player handy, then Corporal Hicks jumps into the fray to help you kick some alien ass, assuming xenomorphs have asses. It's hard for me to overstate just how much I love this game. It's definitely one of my favorite arcade games ever, and it does exactly what I wanted it to do. It doesn't take the premise of the movie in any wild directions, it just gives you a gun and a bunch of enemies and turns you loose, just how I like it. There's a variety of enemies, including some from the Aliens toy line and original xenomorphs designed specifically for the game, as well as a final epic confrontation with the Alien Queen. And it must be said that the graphics and sound for 1989 are simply amazing, one of the better looking and sounding arcade games of that year. And if you've never played it before, I'd make this one a priority. If this was the only game based on aliens, I'd be totally cool with that. But as it turns out, there were others. And how much do you want to bet they didn't hold a candle to this one? Well, in 1987, there were several games based on aliens released for home computers, but I've only ever played one of them, and that's the Japan exclusive Alien 2 for the MSX, Alien 2 being the film's title in Japan. And it's an interesting game in that it's an early work from Squaresoft. Yes, back before they were the house that Final Fantasy built, Square was throwing a lot of shit at the wall to see what would stick, and somehow ended up with the Aliens license, and what they produced is a game that at least tries to capture the spirit of the film it's based on, but falls flat in the gameplay department. This is a side-scrolling action game, which I think was a smart choice, but it's a rather slow-playing and clunky one. And it's one of those games where you press up to jump, which took some getting used to. You start out with a basic rifle and no side weapons, but as you encounter and destroy xenomorph eggs, you'll quickly get power-ups that provide more powerful weapons with limited ammo, a stock of grenades, and a power-up that increases the height and distance of your jump, which you quickly find out is vital as there are gaps in the game that you simply cannot clear without it. Eventually, you'll encounter a variety of xenomorph types, including some that even pop out of the walls, and when killing any enemies, you really need to keep your distance, as true to the film, when they're wounded, they spray acid in their immediate vicinity, which will cause damage to Ripley. At the end of the first stage, you'll likely be surprised to find yourself already fighting the Alien Queen, but this is actually a boss fight that's repeated several times throughout the game, with the Queen becoming more difficult to take down with each encounter. And there is absolutely no strategy to this fight. The Queen just walks back and forth while you simply stay to the left of the screen and shoot her in the head. Rinse and repeat until after 5 stages, the game is over. This certainly isn't the worst game I've ever played. I give it a pass on the graphics and sound considering the hardware it was made for, but this honestly just isn't a very fun game to play. It's clunky and awkward to control, which is where most of the difficulty stems from. And though it's a valiant effort at recreating some of the action from the film, there's just not a lot here to keep me interested. What's surprising though is that there actually was a version also being developed by Square for the Famicom disk system that was for all intents and purposes finished, but never released for some reason. But not long ago, the ROM for this version was made available online, and I have to say it's better than its MSX counterpart. Not by much, mind you, it's still the same basic gameplay, but it controls a bit better, has better graphics and sound, gives you unlimited ammo for your weapons, as well as items to expand your health bar and armor items to reduce damage. And something that annoyed me in the MSX game is that to enter doors you have to stand in front of them and wait for a couple of seconds, but here you simply press the up button to enter. It's not night and day, this game still doesn't have much to offer in terms of gameplay, and it's rather short, but it's still surprising that the better version was shelved. Supposedly because the programming was subpar, but I still prefer it over the MSX version anyway. That's fine though, because in 1987 we also got a superior Aliens game for the Famicom and NES, and it was called Contra. In 1992, the follow-up film to Aliens was released, simply titled Alien 3, and it went in a drastically different direction than its predecessor. Set on a backwater planet that's home to a prison colony, the film immediately subverts the ending of Aliens by killing off Newt and Hicks. It sets a much more depressing and grim tone right away, with Ripley now once again being completely alone and surrounded by the worst kind of criminal scum who haven't so much as laid eyes on a woman in many years. Also, now instead of a legion of Xenomorphs, there's again just one, which you think would be manageable except for the fact that the prison doesn't contain any weapons, so everyone is pretty much screwed. This was also the movie where we discovered the Xenomorph prefers Pepsi. I enjoy this movie despite the fact that it's a complete 180 from the previous film, and despite the fact that the focus on action is pretty much completely absent here. Alien 3 spawned more action games than any other film in the franchise. The one I've played the most is definitely the Sega Genesis game, which pretty much ignores the plot of the film altogether. It's still set on Fury 161, but instead of one alien and no guns, there are lots of aliens and, you know, guns.
Oh my god, guns!
The game is broken up into 15 different maze-like stages, and the objective in each one is to find and rescue a certain number of cocoon prisoners and find the exit before time runs out. Which seems like a simple enough task, but you don't have a ton of time to spare, and of course you'll have to contend with a ton of Xenomorphs that have a habit of coming out of nowhere to ruin your day, as well as respawning in the most inconvenient of places. You're carrying a very handy pulse rifle that has multiple weapon attachments that you can cycle between, such as the flamethrower and the grenade launcher. And at the end of each stage, you're scored on how fast you completed it and how much ammo you had left over. And every so often there's a boss fight against a much bigger Xenomorph, with the final boss being against two of these guys, which is pretty anticlimactic honestly. Overall though, this is a pretty fun run and gun. It's just kind of frustratingly cheap and difficult at times, and there's no continues either, which is a real pain in the ass if you're not playing on emulator. On the other hand, the controls and objectives are straightforward and easy to figure out, and the graphics and sound, all things considered, are pretty damn good for 1992, and despite its shortcomings, I'd say Alien 3 is an above average action offering. It's also a game that had a surprising number of ports, most notable to the Master System and Game Gear in 1993, and these are some pretty solid ports honestly. They use the exact same map layouts as the Genesis game and feature the same gameplay. The only real difference is obviously the downgraded graphics and sound, But on the whole, this one's not too bad. Definitely worth a playthrough if you enjoy the Genesis game, or if you're just a big-time Game Gear or Master System enthusiast. There were also a couple of PC ports, but the only one I've ever played is the version for the Amiga, which, much like the Master System, features the exact same gameplay and stage layouts as the Genesis game, and even looks more or less the same. The main drawback of this port though, absolutely no music during gameplay. If you've ever wondered just how important music is in an action game, play Alien 3 on the Amiga. Nothing gets your heart racing quite like the crushing vacuum of silence. And then there's the NES game, which is a bit of a nightmare to play.
So I say, fuck that thing!
Obviously, the graphics and sound are going to be a big step down, that's not really the issue. But if you thought the Genesis game could be unforgiving, just give this one a try. The object of the game hasn't changed at all, but the stage layouts are completely different and for whatever reason, tend to be even bigger and more labyrinthian than the ones on the Genesis, making this one a confusing and frustrating mess to play, especially if it's your first playthrough. It honestly just makes you wish you were playing the Genesis game instead. My advice, give this one a pass. If you just have to have some 8-bit Alien 3, play the Master System version.
That is crazy! That is horseshit!
Of course, there also had to be an SNES game which was released in 1993. And for a nice change of pace, it's not just a straight port of the Genesis game, but instead does its own thing. It's comprised of 6 very large stages, each featuring a central hub where you can view a map of the stage and see all of your available objectives, which include rescuing stranded prisoners, repairing busted terminals, and destroying clusters of xenomorph eggs. After completing all of these objectives, you move on to the next stage, which features a whole new set to complete, though you'll pretty much be doing the exact same things all throughout the game. You also get a whole bunch of weapons at your disposal, and they're each mapped to a different button on the controller, which is awesome. Much better than having to cycle between them, and overall, this is a much bigger and longer game than its Genesis counterparts, and thankfully features a password system. It's also a damn good looking game with some very detailed environments and an especially impressive opening cutscene. The sound design is pretty good too, but I think I prefer the gritty tunes of the Genesis game, and honestly prefer that game overall, as I'm much more partial to simple and straightforward action games. You may disagree though, so my advice is to play both and decide for yourself. Of course, if you want to play a game based on Alien 3 that has even less in common with the movie than these games do, there is one more option. In 1993, Sega unleashed upon arcades Alien 3 The Gun, which is a non-stop thrill ride from start to finish. It's a rail shooter, and honestly, one of my favorite games of this type. And despite the title, it has very little to do with Alien 3, almost nothing in fact, to the point that Ripley isn't even featured anywhere in the game. You instead play as 1 or 2 nameless space marines that have been sent to Fury 161 in response to a distress call, and then find an infestation of xenomorphs that of course need to be wiped out. And holy hell does this game throw a ton of enemies at you all at once. It's actually kind of hilarious to think that again this game is based on a movie that featured exactly 1 xenomorph and not a single firearm in sight. Here though, in addition to your base machine gun with unlimited ammo, you can also occasionally pick up a flamethrower, and you have a limited supply of grenades which clear the screen of enemies and deal a ton of damage to bosses. You sometimes also encounter non-combatants in the form of prisoners, whom you're not really supposed to kill, but considering the crimes they've been convicted of, you'll be forgiven for taking a few potshots. You'll not only be taking on xenomorphs though, but also the security turrets and the droids of Fury 161, and ultimately a representative of the Weyland-Yutani Corporation that kind of looks like the Bishop character from the end of Alien 3, but not really. Anyway, Alien 3 The Gun does exactly what it says on the tin. It gives you a gun and has you shoot pretty much everything that moves. Does it feel at all like a recreation of the film it's inspired by? Hell no. Is it a lot of fun? You bet your ass.
We're all gonna die. The only question is when. This is as good a place as any to take your first steps to heaven. The only question is how you check out. Do you want it on your feet? Or on your fucking knees?
I don't think he's from around here.
In 1996, a brand new Alien game was released for the PS1, Sega Saturn, and PC, and that game was Alien Trilogy, which you'd be forgiven for thinking would be kind of like Die Hard Trilogy, a retelling of the events of the first 3 films only in video game form. But despite the title, Alien Trilogy features a completely original story that ties in elements from the movies. It begins more or less like Aliens, with Ripley and a bunch of Space Marines landing on LV-426 to investigate what happened to all of the colonists, when suddenly a horde of Xenomorphs attack, killing off all of the Marines and leaving Ripley as the lone survivor, who now must do her best to destroy the alien nest and escape with her life. Gameplay-wise, Alien Trilogy is a fairly straightforward first-person shooter, and I have to say, for the time it was made, it's a damn good one. Along with Doom 2, it's also one of the first FPS games that I ever played. And what a way to be introduced to the genre. Literal demons from hell on one hand, and Xenomorphs on the other. This is a pretty big game, all things considered, featuring 30 stages and 3 boss fights, all being against a different queen alien, which is honestly the weakest part of the game, with each fight being the same and the queen herself actually being surprisingly easy to take down. Aside from that though, this is an awesome game that was definitely made with fans of the series in mind. You start out with a basic pistol, and the objective for each stage is to simply find the exit, but standing in your way are tons of facehuggers, Xenomorphs, and eventually corrupted androids and agents of the Weyland-Yutani Corporation. Luckily, you eventually pick up way more firepower in the form of series classics like the flamethrower, the pulse rifle, the smart gun, and the classic shotgun, which is of course perfect for close encounters.
I'd like to keep this handy for close encounters.
I heard that.
One thing I can vividly remember when playing this game as a kid is that it genuinely creeped me out. It's an action-packed FPS, sure, but there are also plenty of sections that are ominously quiet, leaving you in suspense and anticipation for when the next Xenomorph is going to pop up, giving you a good scare before you blast it into acidic black and green chunks. It's not exactly on the same level as Alien Isolation, but at the time, this felt like it was a horror game just as much as it was an action game, which is greatly helped along by the sound design. The aliens themselves make some pretty creepy and intimidating noises, but the soundtrack is what really does it for me. For the most part, it's very chill and fittingly spacey, but it can create a haunting atmosphere that complements the setting very well. This was also a pretty damn good looking game for its day, blending full 3D environments with 2D sprite-based enemies. And it's one of the first games I can remember playing that used motion capture for their cutscenes, and the opening cutscene especially really impressed me as a kid. And overall, I'd say this game was a great showcase for what the PS1 could do early on. A solid game all around and a very fun FPS, but it certainly wouldn't be the last.
That's it? That's it? No explosions? No hellfire? No... I mean, no, I'm glad everybody's alright, but yeah, that was weak.
In 1997, the world would be graced with a 4th entry into the Alien series, titled Alien Resurrection. Set a couple hundred years after the events of Alien 3, it features a clone of Ellen Ripley, created for the sole purpose of extracting a xenomorph from her body, as apparently cloning her also cloned the queen alien that she was host to when she died. But now Ripley has some more xenomorph-like qualities, such as acidic blood and enhanced physical abilities, while the queen alien now has a womb, and gives birth to a grotesque human xenomorph hybrid thing. And this one just got kind of weird.
Oh, look. Look, beautiful, beautiful little baby.
That's disgusting!
That aside, this is actually a pretty enjoyable blend of sci-fi horror, action, and a bit of comedy, and if nothing else, you can't say it didn't try some new things. It's definitely not for everyone, but in my book, this is a pretty solid film. And of course, there had to be a video game adaptation, which oddly enough, wasn't released until about 3 years after the film, apparently due to some serious issues that plagued its development. So, was it worth the wait? Yeah, I'd say it was. Alien Resurrection is yet another first-person shooter, but it's most notable for being the first console FPS to incorporate both analog sticks, with one controlling your movement in 4 directions, and the other allowing you to look up, down, and all around, which would eventually become the standard for games like this, but at the time was actually pointed out as a negative aspect. Also, this game could be played with the PS1's mouse, which I've personally never tried, but hey, that's pretty cool too. Gameplay-wise, Alien Resurrection is pretty solid. It's a fun FPS, but does lean more into the horror side of things, being rather slow-paced and using ambient sounds and jump scares to keep you on edge, with most sections of the game being completely devoid of music, which actually made me think of Doom 3 a bit, and that's certainly not a bad thing. You also get to play as 4 different characters from the movie, and while they can each make use of a variety of weapons, they also get access to weapons that are unique to each of them, which changes the gameplay up slightly. The biggest drawback here though is the somewhat unforgiving difficulty, thanks mostly to how stingy the game can be with ammo and health pickups. Whatever you finish one stage with is carried over into the next, so if you get a bit trigger happy, you could find yourself backed into a corner with no way to defend yourself, and at that point, you might as well start over again and learn from your mistakes. Or you can do what I do, play with save states. Overall, while certainly not a perfect game, Alien Resurrection features above average gameplay, visuals, and sound design for its day considering the hardware it was developed on, and that it was an early trendsetter for how console FPS games would eventually be played. If you've never seen the movie or played the game, give them both a chance. They just might surprise you.
Fuck.
It's fork.
And that's about all the aliens I can stomach for one video. There are plenty more games out there based on the Alien franchise, but I'll have to save those for a potential future video. For now though, I think I've earned a nice little break from bug hunting. So until next time, dear viewers.
That's it, man. Game over, man. It's game over.
You know what I like? Predator. When I was a kid, I must have watched this movie about 100 times, and 1,000 more since then. The blend of action and horror was executed so perfectly that all these years later, I still don't think it's been topped. It starred Arnold Schwarzenegger at his peak of one-liner spitting, bad guy annihilating 80s awesomeness, and gave him a supporting cast that included the likes of Jesse the Body Ventura and all-time legend Carl Weathers, to create a multitude of masculinity, the likes of which had never been seen before or since. This film is at times very suspenseful and frightening, but also features some of the most explosive and exciting action scenes ever put to film. And the Predator himself is one of the greatest movie monsters of all time, combining cunning and stealth with monstrous size, otherworldly technology, and a face only a mother could love.
You one ugly motherfucker.
Of course, such an awesome movie and concept practically demands to have video game adaptations, and holy hell were there a lot of them. With the most recent Predator Hunting Grounds actually doing a decent job of making you feel like you're really in control of the predator stalking his prey, or being the prey and just doing whatever you can to survive. It's not a perfect game by any means, but it's pretty damn fun. But they can't all be hunting grounds. And since the late 80s, Predator games have ranged from decent to games that are so bad I'd rather get blown away by old Painless than ever play them again. So with that in mind, let's take a look at a big bunch of Predator games. I hope you've all got your one-liners ready.
Stick around.
We get started with a game that at this point is pretty infamous for how bad it is, and that's Predator on the NES. And to me, the worst thing about this game, aside from, the gameplay, of course, is the squandered potential. Predator is such an epic movie with plenty of action, so a side-scrolling 8-bit run-and-gun or action platformer could conceivably be pretty cool, in the same vein as something like Contra or Bionic Commando. But instead, this feels like one of those games where the developer was working on something else when they were given a movie license, and just kinda shoehorned it in there. At its core, Predator is a straightforward platformer that has you controlling Dutch Schaefer, making your way through the jungle of a nondescript Central American country, contending with aggressive wildlife and enemy soldiers, not to mention the titular Predator who occasionally shows up for boss battles. And the goal of each stage is simply to find the exit. What makes it such a pain in the ass to play is that 1, the controls are stiff and not very responsive, and you are woefully underpowered. You start out with nothing but your bare hands, punching all of your enemies to death, just like in the movie. You actually can pick up guns and grenades, but you can only hold one weapon at a time. And as soon as you finish a stage, your weapon magically disappears, and you're back to nothing but your mitts. Which really sucks, because the only time this game ever approaches anything that even comes close to fun is when you're shooting things, but what Predator giveth, Predator also taketh away, making this a game that goes from frustrating to boring and back to frustrating again. The only somewhat shining light comes in the form of Big Mode, where miraculously you're equipped with a machine gun and the gameplay switches to a side-scrolling shooter, which I know is what I said I wanted, but I should clarify that what I meant was that I wanted a side-scrolling run-and-gun that is, good. And this is not good. Again, the controls are rather stiff and unresponsive, and I have no idea why I'm shooting a bunch of bubbles. In fact, while I'm on the subject, what even are half the enemies in this game anyway? Some of them are kind of obvious, the scorpions, for example, which are actually established in the movie, so fair enough. But then there are enemies that look straight out of a game like Dig Dug, lending credence to my theory that this was originally being designed as something else. Anyway, whether it's the platforming stages or Big Mode, this game is just plain bad. It plays like shit, and it doesn't use the license well at all. The only nice thing I can say about it is that some of the music is at least pretty good. But other than that, this is a game that I'll never touch again. And wouldn't you know it, there's actually another version available for the MSX. And is it an improvement over its NES counterpart? Kind of. The basic premise of the game hasn't really changed. You're tasked with finding the exit of each stage on your way to a boss battle with the Predator. But the stages are generally much larger and more maze-like than the NES game, and every stage has a Predator in it. And there's no Big Mode this time around. On the other hand, this game is nice enough to give you an assortment of weapons that actually don't disappear after every single stage, which, needless to say, is a marked improvement. You get a machine gun, hand grenades, and landmines, which you can swap between at any time. And power-ups can be found in each stage to replenish your ammo, health, and give you some extra lives. So gameplay-wise, this is better than the NES game, but it's still not very good. The controls are still quite stiff, the action is generally lacking, and some of the stages are a bit too cryptic for their own good. If the NES game is a 2 out of 10, this is a 3.5. But it does feature some nicer visuals, though that's not really a very tall order. And the soundtrack is surprisingly good, actually, mostly going for a kind of groovy, dreamlike sound, which really doesn't make me think of Predator, but for this game, it's oddly fitting. Anyway, Predator on the NES is terrible, and the MSX game is slightly less terrible. And I was certain that this was as bad as things would get. And then I played Predator on the Commodore 64. Before I go on, I have to say that I blame my British viewers for this. When I made a similar video on Alien games, I got a tongue lashing for leaving out a big bunch of games that were released on home computers like the Spectrum, Amiga, and C64. which I personally had no experience with, but I know were much more prevalent in the UK. So this time around, I was conscious not to overlook those platforms again. And let me tell you, I'm not happy about it, because this was just absolutely miserable. In this version of the Predator, the goal of each stage is simply to run to the right and occasionally shoot a couple of bad guys. And that's about it. And run is quite generous. It's more like a light jog. You might even call it a saunter. And at first I was a bit confused, because it's quickly apparent that you have limited ammo. But there are no icons to replenish it. And it took me a minute to realize that as you progress, you pass by the corpses of your fallen comrades, and their guns are lying next to them. So the only way to get more ammo is to drop the gun you're currently holding and pick up theirs. Which is just one more thing to slow down this already painfully slow game. Most of the time, the screen is completely devoid of enemies, but when they do pop up, they can be taken out with one hit. But since you can't really aim very well unless they're directly in front of you, good luck hitting anything. You're honestly better off just running past them. And every so often, the Predator's laser reticle will start to track you. But it's also really slow, so as long as you keep moving, it's not really a threat. You do eventually have to confront the Predator, as you might expect, and at first, I tried shooting it, but if you do that, it blasts you and you go down with one hit. And this happened over and over again until I finally figured out that the only way to beat him is to drop your gun and take him on hand to hand, which, again, fair enough, that also happened in the movie, kind of.
Bad idea.
But it certainly wasn't voluntary. I guarantee if Dutch had a gun, he sure as hell would have used it. Anyway, you punch and kick the Predator until he's in position under a big log that you can drop on his head, thus completing the game, which, by the way, takes roughly 20 minutes. This is honestly an insulting game. I don't think this thing is even really finished. There are long stretches where there's literally nothing to stand in your way. There are no enemies at all, and you just run to the right. And despite the fact that almost nothing happens in this game, when something does happen, it sucks. This is one of the stiffest, least responsive, borderline unplayable games I've ever encountered. On top of which, the graphics are horrible and the sound design is barely anything at all. Aside from the intro and name input screen, there's no music at all. Just the crushing vacuum of silence punctuated by shitty sound effects. And overall, this is one of the worst games I've ever played. Certainly worse than the NES game, which itself is a prototypical bad game. And just to make sure I covered all my bases, I played the other versions of this game. And here's what I thought of them. Predator on the Amiga. It looks better than the C64 game, but features the same shitty gameplay. There's still no music, but for some reason they included a bunch of ambient sounds like chirping birds and whatnot, which somehow makes the lack of music even more noticeable. Anyway, this version still really sucks. After that, I gave the Amstrad CPC version a try, and believe it or not, it's slightly worse than the Commodore version. It definitely looks a bit worse, and the gameplay is essentially the same, except that sometimes there are absolutely no enemies on screen, and then boom, you're suddenly overwhelmed by an entire battalion. There's just no middle ground with this damn game. Again, one of the worst gaming experiences I've ever had. And then, there's Predator on the ZX Spectrum.
What the fuck is this piece of shit?
And that's about it, as far as the first Predator movie is concerned. Every game based on it was absolutely abysmal, with the MSX game sadly being the best that anyone could come up with. It's truly heartbreaking that such a legendary movie couldn't get even one semi-decent game based on it. But this is of course not where the story ends, as I soldiered forth and moved on to Predator 2. As a sequel, Predator 2 is pretty solid. Not perfect, and not as good as the first film, but it does what a decent sequel should do. It takes the concept and lore established in the first film and expands upon it, while trying something at least a little different. In this case, the premise is simple. We saw how the Predator hunts in a literal jungle, So let's see how he hunts in the urban jungle of Los Angeles in the midst of a record heatwave and plagued by gang violence. In the absence of elite soldiers to hunt, he makes do with gang members, police officers, and armed citizens. And we spend most of the movie with Detective Mike Harrigan, played by Danny Glover. He and his team are trying to figure out just what the hell is killing all of these gang members. And as he gets closer to the truth, he draws the ire of FBI agent Peter Keyes, played by human Muppet Gary Busey.
A fucking alien.
Who actually knows exactly what the Predator is and what it's doing. And he has a plan to capture and study it, which goes about as well as you might imagine. Ultimately, it all comes down to a one-on-one confrontation between Harrigan and the Predator, which plays out as more of a chase than a fight, with Harrigan just doing whatever he can to survive, eventually ending up in the Predator spaceship itself, in a pretty cool scene where we see the extent of their hunting exploits, and that there are indeed a whole bunch of these things. As a reward for defeating a Predator in one-on-one combat, they give Harrigan a pistol from the 18th century, demonstrating just how long they've been visiting Earth, before flying off back into space, leaving him with a hell of a story to tell and a mountain of weird paperwork to fill out. This is a pretty damn good movie, all things considered. It's got a great cast, some decent visual effects, and it strikes a nice balance between horror and action. Again, not as good as the first film, but that's a tough act to follow. And I fully expected any game based on it to suck every bit as much as the previous Predator games. But in a shocking twist, it turns out that there's a Predator 2 game that isn't bad. As a matter of fact, it's actually really good. And that's Predator 2 on the Sega Genesis. This is another one of those games that honestly didn't need to be a licensed game, as with a few exceptions, it doesn't resemble the movie it's based on all that much. It could just as easily be called Crime Squad or something like that, and nobody would really know the difference. It was released a couple of years after the movie hit theaters, and it's the first game developed by Teeny Weeny Games. An awful name for a game studio, by the way, but they'd eventually be rebranded as Perfect Entertainment, and go on to develop the Discworld games, which are pretty cool, and they also ported a bunch of Psygnosis games to the Sega Saturn, such as Wipeout and Crazy Ivan, so they definitely had some talented developers working for them. Predator 2 has you playing as Detective Harrigan, running through various locations around Los Angeles, annihilating an endless legion of criminals, rescuing hostages, and of course going one-on-one with the Predator himself. Or more accurately, one-on-many, as you eventually do make your way to the Predator spaceship, where you take on a whole battalion of these guys. Which, considering it took Harrigan everything he had to survive an encounter with just one of them, isn't really in keeping with the spirit of the movie, but we'll let that slide. For the most part, it's the human adversaries you'll be concerned with, as no matter where the game takes you, there's always an endless wave of bad guys to gun down with various weapons, including machine guns, grenades, and your trusty pistol with infinite ammo. As you blast criminals to bits, they leave behind various kinds of drugs and paraphernalia that can be collected for point bonuses, making this feel more like a sequel to Narc than The Predator. And oh yeah, the hostages. They're kind of important too, as it's only by rescuing a certain number of them that you're able to progress to the exit of a stage. You rescue them by simply walking into them, but you have to be quick, as when you see the 3 red dots on the screen, you know the Predator is zeroing in on one of the hostages. And if you're too slow, he'll blast them into a bunch of bloody chunks, which admittedly does look pretty cool, but also goes completely against the lore established in the movies. The Predator explicitly does not harm unarmed or defenseless targets. But here, screw that. If they didn't want to get blown up, they should have stayed at home. And if you lose too many hostages, you also lose a life. And of course, in the absence of any hostages, the Predator will gladly blast you instead. But oddly enough, he never kills any of the violent criminals, which he certainly did a lot of that in the movie. So yeah, this game doesn't exactly stick to the lore of the films, but it is pretty damn fun, so that can be forgiven. It's just a straightforward run and gun, kill 'em all and let God sort 'em out kind of game. The action is fast-paced and moderately challenging, and the controls are really smooth and easy to get the hang of. There are always plenty of bad guys to mow down, and lots of point bonuses and power-ups to collect. And overall, the gameplay here is pretty solid. The graphics are okay, I guess. It's not exactly gonna blow anyone away, but for a Genesis game from '92 that almost certainly had a tight budget, Predator 2 looks at least decent. And the sound design is pretty good too, with some great sound effects and music that is oddly subdued and kind of funky in certain stages, sounding nothing at all like music from the movie, but again, it's not bad, so I really don't care. And that's it. Kill bad guys, collect drugs, rescue hostages, and have a final showdown with the Predator. Overall, nothing really to complain about with this one. And it even has 8-bit ports on the Master System and Game Gear. This version is a bit different in that it auto-scrolls and the stages are totally linear. While in the Genesis game, they're a bit more maze-like, but the objective is still the same. Waste a bunch of bad guys and collect the drugs they leave behind while also being mindful to rescue hostages as they appear. The Predator doesn't seem to be as interested in killing them this time around though, as when his targeting reticle appears on screen, he pretty much goes after you exclusively. I also find this game to be considerably more difficult than its 16-bit counterpart, especially the boss battles, which start out easy enough but eventually become some real ball busters. But overall, this is another solid game with plenty of action and some decent graphics and sound considering the hardware it was made for. The Game Gear version is essentially the exact same game, with the only real difference I noticed is that the bullets are a bit bigger. But other than that, it's still an all-around solid and fun run and gun. And I have to say that after suffering through those terrible Predator games, it was a breath of fresh air to play some games that are actually well designed. They don't reinvent the wheel or anything, but they are decent playing, fun action games that I'm sure I'll revisit at some point. Especially the Genesis game, which you might even call a hidden gem if you were so inclined. It's really good, and when I realized there was also a Predator 2 game made for home computers like the C64 and Amiga, I was hopeful that they wouldn't be the abominations that I had to suffer through the first time around. And was I right? Again, kinda. This is Predator 2 on the Commodore 64. And as you can see, it's very different from its console counterpart. It's still an action shooting game, but this time around, it's a reticle shooter in the same vein as games like Dynamite Duke and The Punisher on NES, with one key difference. If you've ever played The Punisher, for example, you'll recall that as enemies shoot at you, you can see their bullets incoming and move out of the way to avoid taking damage, which makes sense. Someone shoots at you, you try to avoid getting shot. Not the case in Predator 2 though, as you are locked in place in the dead center of the screen, blasting away at enemies without any care for getting shot. Almost like Harrigan is doing an impression of Wyatt Earp from that one scene in Tombstone.
No!
You can't actually see any of the bullets coming at you, just the muzzle flashes from enemies like you'd see in a light gun game. And if you don't kill them fast enough, they get a hit in. And this game absolutely floods you with enemies from start to finish, which gets overwhelming pretty quickly. You can pick up guns with more stopping power though, and extra ammo to keep them going. Plus, you occasionally get to shoot a rocket launcher, which causes a screen-clearing explosion that annihilates all of your enemies. But other than that, it's just you against a small army of bad guys, and you'll just die over and over again. To the point where I turned on cheats just to see the end of the game. You might be asking yourself, considering this is a Predator game, does, the Predator ever show up? And yeah, a bunch of them do actually. First in the slaughterhouse level, where there are a bunch of Predators and FBI agents wandering around, and you're supposed to only shoot the Predators. Then the final stage takes place on their spaceship, where you shoot a bunch of them, and some of them just run right up on you. In which case, you punch them in the face until they die. And that's it. The game is over. This is an exceedingly simple game. Just shoot everything in sight with the exception of the occasional civilian, and just try not to die. And it's topped off with graphics and sound that, at least for the Commodore 64, are okay. It's not a great game, not even a good game really, but it's still a hell of a lot better than the C64 game based on the first movie, that's for sure. And just like that game, there were ports made to a bunch of other home computers. First up is Predator 2 on the Amiga, which is pretty much the exact same game, except the graphics look much better. And we're even treated to a pretty cool little opening cutscene. On the other hand, this is another Amiga game where you have either music with no sound effects or sound effects with no music, which obviously sucks. Say what you will about the C64 version, at least it had music and sound effects simultaneously. But yeah, I really don't have anything else to say about this one, there isn't much of a difference. Next up though, there is the Amstrad CPC version, and yikes, this is pretty bad. Again, it's the exact same gameplay, except it's super choppy, the graphics are the worst yet, and it's yet another game with sound effects but no music, so in short, it looks, sounds, and plays like absolute dog shit. And finally, we once again come to the ZX Spectrum, and you know what? Yeah, it's still terrible. The visuals are, as is to be expected, the worst of the bunch. It's yet again a game with no music during gameplay, but oddly enough, it actually plays a bit better than the Amstrad version, so take that for what it's worth. But overall, none of the PC games are really any good. 3 out of 10 at best. But on the bright side, at least we got the Genesis and Master System games, which are both genuinely really fun action games that I recommend playing to pretty much anyone with a love for retro gaming. After Predator 2 though, it seemed like interest in making a standalone Predator game died off, in favor of Alien vs. Predator games, which offered a myriad of possibilities when it came to gameplay and presentation, and some of them were pretty damn cool. But it would be another 13 years before we received a game that was dedicated 100% to everybody's favorite extraterrestrial manhunter. This is Predator Concrete Jungle, which was released for the PS2 and Xbox in 2005, and it was developed by Eurocom, a developer that was all over the map in terms of the quality of their games. And in this case, the results are a bit of a mixed bag. On the one hand, I like that this game attempts to give us the experience of actually being the Predator and using all of his various abilities and gadgets as he hunts his prey. But on the other hand, I don't like that it takes all of that good stuff and then builds a game around it where you're doing pretty much all of the cliche things you'd be doing in a lot of other games. Since it's not a movie license game though, we're treated to an original story, which is actually pretty cool. It begins with our protagonist, an elite predator sometimes referred to as Scarface, on a hunt in the fictional New Way City in 1930. When he's critically wounded and his identity is revealed to humans, forcing him to self-destruct his spaceship, wiping the city off the map. But somehow he survives the incident, and as punishment for his blunders, he's stripped of his rank and left to die on a hostile planet. He's a tough bastard though, and manages to survive on his own for 100 years. When his clan finally returns to inform him that the Predator tech he left behind in 1930 has been reverse engineered and is now being used by human beings. So it's up to him to return to Earth, enter the rebuilt New Way City, now called Neonopolis, and hunt down and eliminate any and everyone using the stolen Predator technology. This includes the low-level street gangs using cloaking devices and energy weapons, and runs all the way up to one of the richest and most powerful men in the world, who has in fact been holding a few predators captive and performing experiments on them, including a bit of predator and human gene splicing. And he even has some Xenomorphs kicking around. So even though this is a standalone Predator game, there's still a bit of Alien vs. Predator thrown in for good measure. We'll start with what this game does very well, and that's giving you a ton of different abilities, weapons, and gadgets to play around with that you'll recognize from the films and comics, and even a few things created just for the game. This includes your invisibility cloak, wrist blades, plasma caster, combi stick, spear gun, landmines, smart disc, medicomps, vocal mimicry, and multiple upgrades for all of your various weapons, making the Predator feel more like Batman than anything else. And he has one hell of a vertical leap, and he's strong enough to knock a person's head off with a single strike. Assuming you perform a stealth kill on them, that is, which do get downright brutal. Up to and including ripping their head and spinal cord from their body Sub-Zero style. And I like that a lot. You can also use various different vision modes, which each have a specific use. Either showing the location and mental state of all your enemies, or giving you information about their weapons and weaknesses, even showing you the location of electrical boxes which you'll need to replenish the energy that's depleted when you use your various gadgets, most notably the cloak and the plasma caster. So pretty much anything you've seen the Predator do in a movie, you can do here. But this actually gets a bit overwhelming sometimes. There's so much you can do and only so many buttons available, meaning you'll be needing to pause fairly often to switch items in and out, which creates unwanted breaks in the action and gets a little annoying. For instance, you sometimes need to use your voice mimicry on doors with voice locks, and the first time around I actually forgot how to use it, and accidentally wasted a Medicomp, which is assigned to the same button and you have to swap them out in your gear menu. So it's appreciated that the designers wanted to include all of the Predator's cool abilities, but something a bit more streamlined would have probably been better. But as I said before, you have all of these gadgets and abilities at your disposal, but ultimately, you'll still mostly just be doing pretty standard action game stuff. Killing a whole bunch of anonymous bad guys, destroying specific targets, and taking on some rather bog-standard boss battles. Apparently, the original intention was to have the game take place in one large, interconnected city, a la GTA and the Spider-Man games. But time and budget restraints made that pretty much impossible. So instead, a bunch of the missions take place on large maps that represent different areas of the city. Though in the latter half of the game, the stages become much more linear. A lot of the missions require you to hunt down a group of targets, such as gang members and pimps. And you can be as stealthy as you like in these stages, but honestly, there's no real penalty for just running through the streets and slaughtering everyone in plain sight. Except maybe that you'll draw the attention of more enemies. On the other hand, some missions require stealth, and being detected means an immediate failure. And these missions are honestly more annoying than anything. I know the Predator is a stealth hunter, but he's also the ultimate killing machine. He's not instantly toast as soon as someone sees him. So I could have done without these missions, honestly. And then there are the boss battles, which I think are the worst part of the game. There's no option to be stealthy and hunt down your prey here. You know, that thing the Predator is most known for doing. But instead, these are just straight up hack and slash segments. And damn, do some of these bosses have a ton of health. They can take forever to go down, which makes the Predator seem pretty weak by comparison. And more than anything, these fights are tedious and oftentimes frustrating. Again, I could have done without these, which sounds awful now that I think about it. I could do without about half the missions in this game, and the other half are just okay, I guess. I mean, it's fun running around the stages, killing enemies, blasting them with your plasma caster and ripping their heads off, that's all great. But then you get to the stealth missions and the boss battles, and it all just kind of becomes a slog. Controlling the Predator is pretty fun, especially once you get accustomed to running and jumping around the stages. And some of the gadgets are especially cool. Plus, the absolutely brutal stealth kills are a thing of beauty. You can even unlock additional skins like the Predators from the first two films, and a bunch of others, which is also pretty cool. And I must say, the story, while a bit corny at times, especially some of the vocal deliveries, it's actually pretty interesting, and perhaps one of the best reasons to play this game. At the very least, it's not just another instance of Predators fighting aliens and colonial marines for no real reason. The visuals and sound design are also pretty damn good too. Not exactly mind-blowing, but for 6th gen you can certainly do a lot worse. The issues with Concrete Jungle lie exclusively with the gameplay. Which isn't absolutely awful, mind you, it's fun in spots, but for the most part it's rather mediocre. Eurocom's hearts were definitely in the right place, but the execution just left something to be desired. If you're a Predator fan though, this game is worth playing at least once, if for no other reason than to experience the story and the feeling, however fleeting, that you are the galaxy's most feared and brutal hunter. So that's it, a big bunch of Predator games, a couple of them being pretty good, but most of them just made my head hurt. Overall, the Xenomorphs were treated a lot better with their video game adaptations. But now that I've covered a wide range of both Alien and Predator games, there's really only one logical step to take from here. And I'm both hopeful and a little bit frightened of what's about to come. So until next time, dear viewers, remember,
If it bleeds, we can kill it.
Alien. Predator. They go together like lamb and tuna fish.
Lamb and tuna fish?
Maybe you'd prefer spaghetti and meatballs?
Yes, considering we're in America. I mean, if you don't like spaghetti and meatballs, why don't you get the hell out?
Okay, cool. Aliens and Predators go together like spaghetti and meatballs. If the spaghetti was always trying to kill the meatballs. Both franchises were a great blend of sci-fi, action, and horror. And since they were both owned by Fox, it seemed inevitable that there would be some kind of crossover of the two franchises. And much like Godzilla and King Kong, or Dracula and Frankenstein, the monsters would eventually come to blows in the form of a very successful series of comic books by Dark Horse Comics, which I read and enjoyed quite a lot as a kid. The artwork was great, the stories were interesting, and there was plenty of Predator on Xenomorph action. And eventually there were crossovers with other characters like the Terminator, Judge Dredd, and even Batman, which was insanely cool. And in 2004, we finally got an AVP movie, which was, okay, I guess. There are some cool fights between the Predators and Xenomorphs, but aside from that, this is a pretty weak film. The human characters are very one-dimensional and forgettable. The story could have definitely benefited from taking some cues from the comic books, and perhaps worst of all, it's PG-13. And can you really have a proper confrontation between these two legendary movie monsters when you're trying to keep the blood and gore to a minimum?
Shit, no, man. I believe you get your ass kicked saying something like that, man.
So the movie wasn't so good, but if you're anything like me, the first thing you'll think of when you hear AVP is the many different video games that were made based on the series. Both the Alien and Predator franchises received a ton of video game adaptations of their own, with games like Alien Trilogy, Predator Concrete Jungle, and the Aliens arcade game all being well worth playing. But when the two come together, that's when things get really interesting. So with that in mind, let's take a look at a big bunch of AVP games to find out which ones are worth playing, and which ones deserve to be shot in the face with a plasma caster.
The hunt is on.
Okay, let's start things off with something awesome, and that's the 1994 Alien vs. Predator arcade game by Capcom, which, if my audience polling is anything to go by, is a lot of people's favorite AVP game, and it's really easy to see why. Capcom did the same thing here that they did with a lot of other licenses like The Punisher and Dungeons & Dragons, and turned AVP into a side-scrolling beat-em-up. And it just might be the best beat-em-up they ever produced. The game kicks off with Lieutenant Lynn Kurosawa and Major Dutch Schaefer of the Colonial Marine Corps being dispatched to the fictional city of Sandrad, California, to assist with the containment of a xenomorph infestation when they are quickly overrun. But right before they're about to bite it, they're suddenly saved by a group of predators who are apparently here just for the pleasure of hunting xenos, and the two factions team up. So this game gives you 4 playable characters to choose from. Your 2 human characters, Lynn and Dutch, and 2 predators, the warrior and the hunter. And they're all fun to play as, but with this being an AVP game, I always choose one of the predators. They both come equipped with a melee weapon as well as their plasma caster, which can deal some serious damage to enemies from a long range. But it overheats pretty quickly and needs a cooldown period, which keeps it from being too overpowered. Unless, of course, you find the power-up that gives you unlimited energy for a brief period, in which case, you can just go crazy blasting everything that moves. On the other hand, you have Lynn and Dutch, who represent the speedy and powerhouse character archetypes. Lynn is really quick, and she comes equipped with a katana and an automatic pistol that doesn't overheat, but it does need to be reloaded, which leaves you vulnerable. And then there's Dutch, who brings in some serious muscle, body slamming xenomorphs and hitting them with flying elbows, Macho Man style. And he has a sweet cybernetic arm that also houses a machine gun. So no matter which character you pick, they all have some unique perks, and of course this game is best played with multiplayer, as it comes in both 2 and 3 player varieties. And the gameplay is super satisfying. There are always a ton of enemies on screen, and plowing through them is a ton of fun. And as you progress, you'll encounter more than just Xenomorphs, in particular other colonial marines at the service of the Weyland-Yutani Corporation. And that's when the variety of weapon pickups goes from good to great. You get grenade launchers, plasma rifles, and even the iconic smart gun. And honestly, there's nothing quite like seeing a predator armed with a smart gun mowing down everything in sight. And each level is capped off with a sweet boss battle, mostly against various iterations of the Xenomorphs, but also including some bad blood predators that have turned against you. And the whole thing wraps up with a showdown against the Alien Queen. This is a game that no matter how many times I've played it, if someone asks me if I want to play it again, I always say hell yeah, because it's just so damn fun. Beating the bejesus out of endless waves of Xenomorphs, firing indiscriminately in the bonus stages, and just soaking up the fantastic visuals and sound design is just something that never gets old. Again, this just might be Capcom's greatest beat-em-up ever, and has to be considered high in the running for best arcade beat-em-up of all time. Even though this wasn't the first AVP game ever released, it was the first one I ever played. And man, what a way to be introduced to the series. And soon after, I found out there was actually another AVP game on the SNES.
That was a great game.
This version of AVP was released about a year before the arcade game, but I'd somehow never seen or heard of it until after I had already played the Capcom game. And I mistakenly assumed this was a port of that game, but it was in fact one of the first games to be developed by Jorudan, a developer that has a ton of games to their name, most of which I have absolutely no interest in playing. But how did they do with the AVP license? Well, most people might tell you that this game is absolute bottom of the barrel trash, but I think that's going a bit too far. This is a competently made beat 'em up with simple controls, a few cool ideas, and at least decent graphics and sound. The story is set in the distant future on a planet called Vega 4, where an excavation crew accidentally stumbles upon a xenomorph hive, unleashing the creatures on the city of New Shanghai. When they send out a distress beacon, it catches the attention of the Predator, who descends to Vega 4 for a good old-fashioned bug hunt. The two main issues with this game is that 1, it is single player only, which is always a bad sign for a beat 'em up. And 2, there is a serious lack of variety to the gameplay, which makes it get boring and tedious rather quickly. For starters, the controls are actually quite good, giving you a basic punch and jump setup like Final Fight, but also assigning a button to your plasma caster, which in this game there's no limit to how much you can use it. So if you're anything like me, you'll abuse the hell out of this thing. But if you overcharge it, you perform a super attack that covers the entire screen, but also drains a bit of your health. Aside from that, you can do a slide attack by pressing the shoulder buttons, which deals only minor damage to enemies, but is the only way to take out smaller enemies, those being the face huggers and chest bursters. You also get a few weapon pickups in the form of smart discs, the spear, and a temporary invisibility cloak, as well as health and point bonuses, which come in the form of xenomorph skulls. But something that annoyed the hell out of me with this game is that if you're holding either the smart disc or spear, you can't pick up any other items until you run out of that weapon, which really sucks when you want to hold on to one but also need to pick up a health replenish. That aside, my main gripe with this game is that aside from the occasional smaller enemies and the bosses, there are only 2 main enemy types that you'll contend with, both being variations of the Xenomorphs. And there are only ever 1 or 2 on screen at a time, which I get is due to hardware limitations, but constantly fighting the same 2 enemies over and over again for the entire game gets old pretty quickly. And the boss battles, while featuring some cool enemy designs, can also be kind of irritating, employing some very cheap tactics, to which my response was just to spam the plasma caster as much as possible. And after about 45 minutes or so, the game is over. Like I said, there's really nothing wrong with the controls or the core gameplay, and the visuals and sound design are pretty decent too. For the most part, anyway. But the lack of multiplayer and gameplay variety just makes this one kinda boring. And after playing through it once, you'll probably never feel the need to play it again. It's not horrible, just mediocre, especially when compared to its arcade counterpart. But I soon learned that when it comes to AVP games, you can do a lot worse. This is Alien vs. Predator: The Last of His Clan for the Game Boy, which was released in 1993 and developed by ASK Kodansha. And I know it's a Game Boy game and they were working with some very limited resources, but this game just sucks. The plot is that yet again, in the distant future, human beings are terraforming and mining a planet called Alpha Centauri 3. And when the Predators notice this, they actually send down a bunch of Xenomorph eggs, eventually wiping out all of the humans on the planet just so they can have their hunt. So yeah, in this game, the Predators are kind of assholes. Very different from the Capcom game. But due to the presence of an alien queen, there are way more Xenomorphs than first anticipated, leading to all but one of the Predators being killed, and that's you. Now on a mission to kill the alien queen and regain your clan's honor. So this is a side-scrolling platformer that has you navigating through a series of maze-like levels, killing enemies and finding the various items like bombs and keys that you need to progress through the stage and past the exit. You have access to your various weapons like your wrist blades, smart disc, and plasma caster, and you encounter the usual Xenomorphs, face huggers, and chest bursters you might expect. And you have a final confrontation with the alien queen. That's all well and good on paper, but the actual experience of playing this game starts out as confusing as you navigate the stages, then progresses to frustrating, and finally settles on boring. There are 6 missions in total, not including the final boss fight, and you do the exact same thing in every stage. Find bombs to knock down the walls in your way, and find the key that allows you to exit the stage while taking out the enemies that pop up in your path. And it's just not fun to play. This is one of those games that after about 5 minutes or so you realize that this is it. And from that point on, it feels like more of a chore to play than anything else. But if you were a kid and your parents had just bought this game for you, then you kinda had to just suck it up and try to trick yourself into having fun with it. As an adult with a crappy YouTube channel though, I can be as honest as I wanna be when I say this game sucks. But I did get a laugh from watching the Predator climb up and down ladders. So at least there's that. I can appreciate that the developer thought it was a better idea to have the Game Boy game be some kind of action platformer, which in hindsight, I can imagine being pretty cool. Maybe playing like Bionic Commando or something like that. But this was just an absolute misfire. Another game I don't think I'll ever have the desire to revisit. But we're just getting started, as a new generation of gaming consoles was right around the corner, and with it came a whole new way to experience AVP.
Ah!
Mom.
In 1994, only about 6 months after the AVP Arcade game was released, we got Alien vs. Predator on the Atari Jaguar, which itself was a console that always seemed to have some potential, but just never had the library of software to make it worth the $250 investment. Like, I can remember thinking that it was impressive that there was such a thing as a 64-bit console on the market, but the only game that ever made me look twice was Alien vs. Predator, which I finally got to play in 1995 at that one friend's house whose parents gave them everything. And I was simultaneously impressed by the visuals and underwhelmed by the gameplay, remarking that it wasn't as fun as the arcade game, which in turn pissed off my friend and compelled him to turn the game off. Going back to it now though, I may have judged it a bit harshly, because this game is actually pretty decent despite its flaws. For starters, it's the first game in the series that actually lets you play as a Xenomorph, which is cool, though it does take some time to wrap your head around playing a first-person shooter, except you can't, shoot anything. And you can't heal yourself either. Also, this is a good time to mention that no matter what character you're playing as, you'll be seeing the same environments, which in this case is the Golgotha Marine Corps training base, and each character has a different ultimate objective. In the case of the Xenomorph, you start out in the alien hive and have to make your way to the Predator ship to free the Queen Alien. And along the way, you'll encounter Colonial Marines and Predators that you can take out with your claws, tail, and attack tongue, which I just found out is what that thing is called. You have to play hit and run though, because as I said, you have no ability to heal yourself, but instead you'll need to cocoon downed soldiers, which then act as respawn points when you die. So you'll probably cocoon quite a lot of them. Aside from that though, it's just a simple matter of making it from point A to point B, either by roaming the halls or using the air ducts to get around the base. And this is definitely the most unorthodox character to play as, but it is pretty fun, though this is also by far the shortest campaign in the game. On the other hand, you've got the Predator, who in this case starts out with only his wrist blades for a weapon, and you have to earn all of your other weapons over time. You do this, as you might expect, by killing enemies, but there is a catch, in that at any time you can turn on your invisibility cloak. But if you kill enemies while invisible, it doesn't earn you any honor. So you'll be creeping around while invisible, then drop your cloak to make the kill, and then go invisible again until you unlock some better weapons, like the combi stick, the smart disc, and ultimately the plasma caster, which you absolutely need as you can't defeat the final Alien Queen boss without it. So you'll be seeking out every enemy you can find, just trying to unlock those damn weapons, which does get pretty challenging in spots, especially when faced with an area filled with Marines wielding pulse rifles and flamethrowers. But luckily the Predator can pick up and use medkits that you find lying around the stages. And the ultimate goal for the Predator is just to make your way to the Xenomorph hive and kill the Alien Queen, thus earning you a great deal of honor, and presumably a gift certificate to the best water park in Yoncha Prime. Anyway, of the three playable characters, I found this one to be the most frustrating, at least at first. It gets better after you unlock some more weapons, but when all you've got is your wrist blades, it gets a bit tedious playing hide and seek with your enemies. You're not as vulnerable as the Xenomorph, and this campaign is considerably longer than that one, but it's also not nearly as fun as playing as the Colonial Marine. In particular, you're playing as a guy named Private Lance J. Lewis, who is being held in the brig for striking an officer when he's released from his cell after the Xenomorph attack. And your ultimate goal for this campaign is to activate the base's emergency self-destruct sequence and flee the planet in an escape pod, which the game only gives you 2 minutes to do, so you'd better know where that damn thing is, otherwise you're screwed. And that brings me to what is probably the most irritating thing about this game, which is how maze-like and difficult to navigate it is, which isn't helped by how samey the environments look, which forces you to rely on your map quite a lot to find your way around. And when playing as the Marine, the main thing you'll be doing, aside from blasting Xenomorphs, is looking for keys and other items you need to progress from one area to the next. And yes, it does get rather confusing. On the other hand, this is the most fun character to play as because it plays more or less like any other first-person shooter from the day, giving you an assortment of weapons, including the shotgun, pulse rifle, flamethrower, and finally the smart gun. And there's no shortage of enemies to mow down. Though something else that'll really bug you is that every Xenomorph you kill leaves behind an acid puddle that hurts you if you walk over it, which is easy enough to avoid at first, but they never disappear. So after you've killed about 1,000 of these things, they become pretty much unavoidable. And you do also encounter some predators who are much harder to take down, but thankfully, there aren't nearly as many of them. But yeah, this is an AVP game where the most fun way to play it doesn't involve playing as either an alien or a predator. But overall, I had a decent bit of fun with this game. The visuals aren't so great, particularly the mostly bland-looking environments, but the character models definitely have a charming quality to them. But the sound design I thought was, for the most part, quite good. Admittedly, the weapon sound effects are not authentic to the movies, but the Xenomorph and Predator sounds are, and there's a heavy reliance on ambience, which, especially when playing as the Marine, creates a really creepy vibe, which, similar to Alien Trilogy, makes this feel like a horror game as much as it is an action game. Anyway, this was my first time playing this game since I was a kid, and I thought it was okay. Not a masterpiece, mind you, but a good bit of fun. Rebellion, the developer of this game, at least had a solid idea in mind, but perhaps the hardware just wasn't up to snuff for them to realize their full vision. But luckily, they would eventually get another crack at developing an AVP game.
Wait a minute.
In 1999, Rebellion developed another AVP game, this time for PC, again simply called Alien vs. Predator, and it's essentially the same premise as their previous effort, giving you the choice of playing as a Xenomorph, a Predator, or a Colonial Marine, and advancing through a series of stages with different objectives. But in addition to being a much better looking and sounding game, as you might expect, it's just a whole lot more fun to play. And this time around, each character plays through their own unique levels and has a different story to follow. So as the Xenomorph, you start out in your hive, killing any of the humans that were stupid enough to enter it, before going on a killing spree that eventually has you boarding a spacecraft headed for Earth. And playing as the alien is again the most unorthodox and also the shortest campaign, but it's a hell of a lot of fun. You move ridiculously fast and can stick to walls and ceilings, getting the drop on your unsuspecting victims. Again, attacking with your claws and tail, which rip through these guys like tissue paper. And you do still have the use of your attack tongue, but in this game it's used exclusively to attack people's heads, just like in the movies. And this is how you'll replenish your health, so no more cocooning for you. Aside from killing every human you come across, you'll mostly just be hitting switches to open up your path to the end of each level. And the final boss of this campaign is a fight with not one, but two predators, which honestly isn't all that tough. And I guess I could say the same for the game as a whole. While it's a ton of fun, it's not exactly the most difficult to get through, as each of your playable characters is a total badass in their own right. But yeah, the Alien campaign is cool, but not as cool as the Predators. When playing as the Predator, you have access to pretty much his entire arsenal of weapons, which includes the spear gun, plasma caster, and wrist blades, which are perfect for close encounters. Plus, you have multiple vision modes to make it easier to spot humans and Xenomorphs, which is indispensable here as some environments are way too dark and others have an obnoxious amount of flickering lights, which obstruct your vision. Also, you can activate your invisibility cloak whenever you want, but just like in Predator Concrete Jungle, using your cloak and plasma caster drains your energy, which can only be refilled with energy cells that you find scattered around each stage. And when you're playing as the Predator, it feels like total overkill, as you can pretty much one-shot any of the enemies as long as you have a bit of plasma energy. And even without it, your wrist blades and spear gun make short work of flimsy little humans and Xenomorphs. That is, until you eventually encounter something the Weyland-Yutani Corporation had been hard at work on: cybernetically augmented Xenomorphs, which is insanely cool, basically blending together a Xenomorph and a Terminator. And the whole thing concludes with a final showdown against the Alien Queen. Basically, when you're playing as the Predator, you feel appropriately like an absolute badass, an elite killer of the highest order, and it's extremely satisfying to blast enemies with your plasma caster or knock their head off with a single swipe. And while the Predator campaign in the first game was arguably the most boring, it's arguably the most fun here. Then there's the Marine campaign, which again feels the most like just a traditional FPS from 1999. Giving you the usual assortment of weapons like the pulse rifle and smart gun, this time around with their appropriate sound effects. And each stage requires you to flip switches and find keys and other items to progress. And the entire time you're constantly under assault by Xenomorphs. And the action is fast-paced and intense. I said the Predator campaign might be the most fun overall, but the Marine campaign is definitely the most exciting, constantly keeping you on your toes. But it's also the most difficult of the three. Again, there are a lot of areas that are really dimly lit, forcing you to rely either on flares or your night vision to even be able to see what the hell is going on. And overall, just like the previous game, there's definitely an element of straight-up horror here. And all throughout the game, you'll be getting video messages from various other characters, who are obviously played by people who worked at Rebellion, which I must admit is funny and has a real charm to it, reminding me that this was still a time when devs had to work around technological and budgetary limitations. But the final product is something that's pretty impressive for its day. This was a pretty damn good looking game back in 1999 and features a whole bunch of references to the Alien film series, including levels set on LV-426, Fury 161, and even coming across the fossilized space jockey, which I certainly appreciated as an Alien fan. Also, the sound design is once again really good, this time around with sound effects that are more faithful to the films and a much more energetic and exciting soundtrack. So all things considered, this was a great game for its day, and things were only looking up for AVP games. In 2001, AVP 2 was released on PC, and this time around was developed by Monolith Productions, who had already developed some pretty cool first-person shooters, like Blood and No One Lives Forever. So having them work on this one must have seemed like a great idea. And yeah, this is another really good game. Arguably the best of the bunch. It certainly looks a lot better than the first game, which is what you'd expect, but still, for only 2 years later, this is quite the jump up in quality. And unlike the previous game that featured 3 separate campaigns that had seemingly nothing to do with each other, here they all intersect, and each character once again is playing on the same maps. With the game being set on a planet where Weyland-Yutani is, as usual, performing some wild experiments on both Xenomorphs and Predators. The Alien campaign this time around is especially cool as it takes you through the entire life cycle of a Xenomorph, starting you out as a facehugger, staying out of sight, and finding a guy to ambush, only to then wake up as a chestburster where you have to bite your way through the guy's chest, in a sequence that is especially cool. You then scurry around the stage looking for soft targets to take out until you can finally grow to full size and start really doing some damage. After that, the gameplay is similar to the previous game. You're still killing everything in sight, chewing on people's heads to restore your health, and making your way from point A to point B in an effort to free the alien queen and establish Xenomorph supremacy. It's still a lot of fun, though your movement speed is considerably slower in this game. But they kinda make up for it by giving you a long-range lunge attack, and once again, you can rip through humans like tissue paper. And as always, this is very satisfying. So some changes were made, but overall, playing as the Xenomorph is still a good bit of fun. The Predator, on the other hand, isn't quite as fun to play as he was in the previous game, due in large part to the fact that you're not given all of your weapons right away, with the Plasma Caster only being acquired about 2/3 through the game. So you'll be relying a lot more on melee combat, stealth, and the element of surprise, which, fair enough, that's how the Predator hunts. But still, it is a lot more fun when you're running around blasting everything that moves with your Plasma Caster. You do get a new high jump ability though, which is especially useful for outdoor areas, as it allows you to move along the treetops and stalk your prey. But overall, I think just like the Jaguar game, the Predator campaign is the weakest of the bunch here. Primarily because, at least at the start of the game, the Predator has been kind of nerfed. It's still an enjoyable campaign, just not as fun as the Xenomorph this time around, and certainly not as fun as the Marine campaign. If the previous game's Marine campaign was about pure action with a bit of horror sprinkled in, this one feels like a bit more of an even split. It has you playing as a colonial Marine named Frosty Harrison, who has come to this research center along with his fellow Marines to investigate a communications blackout. And at first, it's a bit of a slow burn, being purely atmospheric as you try to piece together what happened, before finally encountering some Xenomorphs. And at various points in the game, things do slow down a bit as you try to reach your objectives, letting the tension take over as you make your way through dimly lit corridors, even hitting you with the occasional jump scare. But once the fight is on, you've got a ton of weapons to make use of, including old classics like the pulse rifle and smart gun, but they also threw in a rocket launcher and even a sniper rifle, which comes in very handy. So there's definitely plenty of fun shooting action here, but it does also drive home the fact that the Xenomorphs and Predators are terrifying monsters, and you are in fact their prey, which is how it should be. You want to have fun while playing as the Marine, but you have to remember whose game this is. And overall, AVP 2 is a really fun game regardless of which character you're playing as, even if each campaign is a little on the short side. This is still a game that's worth revisiting today. And after this, we wouldn't see another AVP first-person shooter for about 9 years. And what came next was instead something completely different.
Alien vs. Predator Extinction.
In 2003, we received what I think is a real black sheep of AVP games, and that's Alien vs. Predator Extinction, which is notable for 1, being the first console exclusive game in the series in about a decade, and 2, that it's a real-time strategy game, which in theory seems totally counterintuitive. The AVP games had always been about just straight-up action, whether that be in the form of a beat-em-up or a first-person shooter, because the entire premise is that these alien monsters are fighting each other and humans are caught in the middle. But here we slow things down a bit and strategize, which as it turns out is still pretty fun, or at least it is sometimes. The plot of the game is very loose, but essentially the Weyland-Yutani Corporation is terraforming a planet when they uncover a xenomorph hive, which prompts the company to send in the Marines to eliminate the threat. And this attracts the attention of a clan of predators just looking for a good time. And that's about it. It's nothing especially deep, but that's fine because it's not a narratively driven game. You just want to get right to the gameplay. And just like with the previous handful of games, you have the option of playing as the aliens, the predators, or the space marines. And they all come with unique objectives and variations on the gameplay. The initial concern is that an RTS can't possibly play as well on a console as it can on a PC. And while that's true, AVP Extinction has a surprisingly simple and intuitive control scheme that makes the gameplay feel at least fairly smooth, with your primary objectives typically being collecting resources, killing enemies, and taking over the map bit by bit, with the Xenomorphs definitely being the most difficult to use, as the developer was hell-bent on being as accurate as possible with their life cycle. So first, you need an alien queen to lay eggs, which then release face-huggers that attach to enemies, then producing a chest-burster that has to cocoon itself before it can become a full-grown adult. And this can obviously be a very time-consuming process, especially if you want to max out your squad at 45 Xenos, which you'll definitely want to because those Marines and Predators can make pretty quick work of your troops, with this actually being a pretty damn tough game after you make it past the first handful of maps. And it really is a pain in the ass to spend all of that time building up your squad just to have them wiped out in about a minute. Eventually, you can start laying eggs that hatch more than one facehugger, and they can even impregnate hosts with more than one chestburster. You have a variety of different xenomorphs that you can create up to and including the Pred Alien. And it is really cool when you've got a whole bunch of fully grown xenomorphs running around the map and swarming all over your enemies. But the path to get there can be a bit tedious. The Predators, on the other hand, I found to be much more fun and immediately gratifying to play as. You don't have as many units available to you, with only 12 at the start of the campaign up to 20 by the end. But they're tough as hell and there's a wide variety of units available to you, with the Brawler being the most basic, only using melee wrist blade attacks. But there are also Predators that specifically use the Plasma Caster, Spears, Smart Discs, and there's even a type of fully armored Predator that fights with a scythe. And they look like something straight out of Warhammer 40k. And they can all be summoned to the battlefield via a mobile shrine that also attacks enemies with lasers as it hovers around the map. The objectives for the Predators are also the easiest to wrap your head around. Just kill everything in sight and take their skulls as trophies, with each map having a high value target that you'll need to take out to clear the mission. And honestly, playing as the Predators almost feels like cheating, because there's just so much they can do and they can take a ton of punishment, even being able to heal themselves and use their invisibility cloaks to get the drop on enemies. And there's just something so satisfying about seeing an entire squad of 20 Predators absolutely annihilating everyone in sight and then tearing their heads off afterwards. The Colonial Marines, on the other hand, play more like you'd expect from an RTS like this, mostly being tasked with destroying targets, retrieving valuable items, or repairing the numerous atmospheric processors dotted around the map. And by doing all of this, you get the resources and money you need to call in more Marines. And they come equipped with weapons like pulse rifles, smart guns, flamethrowers, and even exosuits that pack some serious firepower. You always need to have at least one comm soldier though, since they're the only ones that can call in the dropship to deliver more Marines. Plus, you'll always want to have a medical soldier handy and an android, as they're the only ones strong enough to carry around large items, which is often crucial to clearing a mission. For the most part though, when you're playing as the Marines, it's all about having the superior firepower, so that when an enemy is foolish enough to peek its head out, they get absolutely annihilated. And you'll not only be fighting Xenomorphs and Predators, but also rogue synthetics that have some pretty gnarly weaponry of their own. And this campaign is also great fun because, hey, who doesn't like compiling a team of ultimate badasses to run roughshod all over an alien planet? Overall, I was actually kinda surprised by how much fun I had with Extinction. I wasn't sure an RTS would work well with this series, but the developers at Zono did a pretty good job here. It's not the greatest RTS ever made or anything, but it's worth at least a playthrough if you're an AVP fan, or just an RTS fan in general. What came next, though, that was a different kettle of facehuggers altogether. In 2007, we received a second Alien vs. Predator movie, titled AVP Requiem, and it's,
This is not good.
Yeah, even though it carries an R rating and had the blood and gore ramped way up, it's just not a very enjoyable movie. It directly follows the previous film with the Pred alien getting loose aboard the Predator spaceship, where a battle ensues, resulting in the ship crash landing in a small town in Colorado. So, to ensure the destruction of the Pred alien and keep Predator technology out of the hands of humans, a supremely badass Predator referred to as Wolf heads down to Earth to take care of business. And caught in the middle of all this is a cast of bland, forgettable CW characters that are really only here to get slaughtered. And this could at least be kind of cool in theory, but the execution leaves a lot to be desired. And as many people have pointed out, this movie is way too damn dark. It's so dimly lit that most of the time when something cool is happening, you can barely see it, which needless to say can really ruin a viewing experience. So yeah, it's not the worst movie ever made or anything, but it is yet another AVP dud. And wouldn't you know it, it spawned the one and only movie tie-in game, when AVP Requiem was released on the PSP also in 2007. And much like the movie, this is a pretty lackluster effort. It's actually made me reevaluate how I feel about Predator Concrete Jungle. Because in that game, even though I felt like the gameplay was ultimately kinda mediocre, the developer at least put a lot of effort into making the Predator look, feel, and most importantly play like the Predator should, with all of his various gadgets and abilities, and allowing for a bit of stealth and strategy when approaching at least some of the missions. Here though, while you're playing as the Predator, Wolf in this case, you don't behave much like a Predator would, with this being pretty much a totally linear, bog-standard action game. Instead of being any kind of stealth hunter, you just run right up on your enemies and start slashing away, or unload on them with the plasma caster, maybe toss a smart disc at them, but using rooftops and treetops to move around while remaining unseen is totally off the table. You just sort of jog along at a leisurely pace without any care for, actually hunting your prey. You can use an invisibility cloak, but this really only comes in handy during specific sections of the game, where you're tasked with getting by humans without being spotted. And the objective of destroying the Predator tech and any traces of the Xenomorphs is also present here, as in each stage there will be dead facehuggers and bits of the downed spaceships scattered around that you'll also be tasked with destroying, and they're all conveniently marked on your map. And this game is totally linear. You won't be doing any exploring or finding the best way to approach a stage. Just follow the map where it leads you, kill some enemies, activate a whole bunch of switches, and proceed to whatever awaits you at the end of the stage. There are quite a lot of different stages here though, offering you 3 branching paths that take you through the town and the wilderness surrounding it. So there's at least a bit of a change in scenery, but ultimately you'll still just be doing the same thing regardless of which route you take. And to be fair, the combat here isn't absolutely abysmal. It is at least kind of fun slashing up Xenomorphs and blasting them with your plasma caster, but the lack of any kind of variety in the gameplay has it getting old rather quickly, and eventually it felt like kind of a chore to play, making this the PSP equivalent to the SNES game, I guess. It's certainly not a bad looking game by PSP standards. It's not amazing, mind you, but I really didn't mind the visuals, and the sound design is at least decent too. But at the end of the day, AVP Requiem is just kind of a slog to play. Even if you're a fan of the series, I don't recommend playing this one. It's really too bad too, because AVP was on a bit of a roll there, mostly giving us some very enjoyable games to play. But thankfully, Requiem was not the final game based on the series, because something much better was right around the corner. If by corner you mean 3 years. In 2010, Rebellion, the developer of the Jaguar and first AVP games, returned to try their hand one more time with this series with the simply titled Alien vs. Predator for PC, PS3, and Xbox 360. And while it received a mixed reaction at the time, I've personally always thought this was, for the most part, a very enjoyable game. The story kicks off with the Weyland-Yutani Corporation once again doing some shady experiments on an alien world, and attempting to unravel the secrets of an ancient predator pyramid, again accidentally unleashing a plague of xenomorphs, which in turn requires the services of a squad of colonial marines, attracting the attention of a predator, who this time around is not only seeking the thrill of the hunt, but also trying to maintain the integrity of the ancient burial ground. And all of the separate campaigns interconnect in some way, and will have you playing through the same maps as each of the 3 playable characters. And if you're a gorehound, you can rest easy, because this game has got you covered. The Alien campaign has you playing as a xenomorph called Number 6. That's being experimented on in a lab. And when everything goes tits up, you escape your confinements and start eviscerating everything in sight, escaping from the lab and taking the fight to the Marines and Predators, with the final stage in particular pitting you against 3 Predators back to back, which needless to say is a pretty tough fight, and also exposes how clunky the melee combat can be. But for the most part, you'll be running around at lightning speed and sneaking up on people to perform some especially brutal stealth kills with your claws, tail, and attack mouth. This can be a lot of fun, but for a large portion of the game, it's also not really necessary, as a lot of the time your only real objective is to get from point A to point B, and it's pretty easy to bypass enemies as opposed to confronting them, which is obviously the safer tactic, but not nearly as fun. So you'll often find yourself deviating from your main objective to just go ham and kill everything in sight, just for the satisfaction of hearing them scream. Even if you do this though, the Alien campaign is extremely short. If you're playing on the default difficulty and not taking too many detours, you can finish it in about an hour. It's a fun hour for sure, but that's not a lot of bang for your buck. The Predator campaign, conversely, is quite a bit longer, and I think it's a lot more fun. Mostly because, again, it just makes you feel like an absolute beast, giving you a big bunch of weapons to make use of, and including that sweet super jump that really comes in handy for getting the drop on your enemies. Which, much like the Xenomorph, means you can perform some excessively violent stealth kills. Like seriously, Rebellion went all out on the blood and gore here, approaching Mortal Kombat levels of absurdity, and I absolutely love it. In your arsenal, you have your Plasma Caster, which one-shots pretty much any regular enemies in the game, but also eats up a ton of your energy. And you also have remote bombs, which are fun to play around with, the Smart Disc, which also consumes energy, and the Spear, which is another one-shot kill kind of weapon. You also have twin wrist blades, which are not only useful for stealth kills, but you'll also use them when engaging in melee combat, primarily with Xenomorphs. And again, this is when the game is at its least fun, as sometimes it really feels like you're forced into these fights, when what you'd really rather do is just kill them from long range. But on the other hand, it does open the door to some pretty gnarly executions, which are just plain cool. But really, you'll be having the most fun here when you're just silently stalking your prey, and either tearing their heads off or watching them explode into a bunch of bloody chunks with your Plasma Caster. Finally, there's the Marine campaign, which is roughly the same length as the Predators, and much like the second AVP PC game, this one leans much more into the horror side of things, giving you lots of dimly lit and creepy corridors to move through, while waiting for the next Xenomorph attack. And you have your usual assortment of weapons, though I must admit I was pretty disappointed in the pulse rifle and smart gun, due in part to the fact that their sound effects aren't correct, but also because they're kind of underpowered here, instead taking a back seat to the shotgun and especially the long-range sniper rifle, which you can one-shot enemies with if you tag them in the head. Other than that though, you know the drill. Explore various maps, find items, hit switches, and shoot anything that moves, whether that be Xenomorphs, Predators, or hostile synthetics, which probably pose the biggest threat, as they're armed about as well as you are. But on the other hand, the Xenomorphs deal some crazy splash damage, to the point where I was often more concerned about that than I was with, actually being attacked by them. But ultimately, this is a very intense, action-packed, occasionally creepy, and very fun first-person shooter. The Marine campaign is solid, and I can say the same for the overall visual and audio design. with this still being a pretty decent looking game even today, with some detailed environments and the pure carnage candy of those stealth kills being a thing of beauty. And even though some of the weapon sound effects are definitely not what they should be, in general the music, sound effects, and even the voice work is pretty good. So while it's certainly a flawed game, the 2010 iteration of Alien vs. Predator is a lot of fun and still worth revisiting. So that's it, all of the AVP games on consoles and PC. And it's quite a mixed bag, but for the most part, I had a lot of fun with these. As for which ones are the best, the retro gamer in me says the arcade game, which again is one of the best beat-em-ups ever made. But I also have to give a nod to the Rebellion games for just being solid and fun first-person shooters that did their best to give a faithful AVP experience. And as for the worst, well, that's easy. Don't ever play the Game Boy game, as it just plain sucks. And you can also pass on the PSP game, as it's just plain boring. The SNES game is also really boring, but at least it has an excuse. It was largely limited by the hardware it was made for, but the PSP game could have been a lot better. Anyway, that's all for this video. I've definitely had my fill of Xenomorphs and Predators, and I want nothing more than to go down for a nice long hypersleep. So until next time, no matter how much you might want to, if you see a slimy egg, resist the urge to look directly into it. The consequences could be dire.
Oh no, not again.